Well, thank you everyone for having me. I haven't done like I was if you happen to see me struggle to get this PowerPoint online, it's been a while since I've done a Zoom presentation, but I'm glad we got it to work. I'm so excited to be talking to you all about the museum. When I do these in person, I usually start with a show of hands to just see who has visited the Kansas Museum of History before. So I'll still ask it. And Sam, you can tell me if you see anyone's hands there. And
I see in the room here, I see like four hands going up, and I visited. It's been quite a while, but I have visited. And then
yeah,
I see, oh, okay, some people on Zoom also raising their digital hands.
great. Well, good. I'm always just interested to hear. And a lot of times I will actually get someone like you say, well, I've been, but it's been a long time, 10, 15, even 20 years. And I would say that's fine. It probably honestly didn't change all that much from what you remember however many years ago up until September of 2022. That is when the Kansas Museum of History closed for the major renovation of its permanent exhibit gallery. And it took us a little over 3 years, but we reopened the museum on November 22nd, 2025. And I guess I'll ask one more time, has anyone been since we opened?
We went the 23rd.
Nice, great. It was busy that day. I remember we had like 600 people that day.
Lots of kids, yes. Wow.
Great. Well, hopefully, if you haven't been yet, this presentation today will inspire you to make a visit. I can promise you it looks entirely different and than what you have seen before. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is really more about what some of the talk about some of the challenges of the project that and you'll get to learn a little bit about me personally because my story weaves through this very closely, but also just challenges of the project overall. But then of course the changes that you can expect as well. And I'll just ask you to kind of hold on to a question as as we go tonight, just to think about how do you make a museum? That's the title of my presentation. And I think that I'll give you an answer that I share. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. And so essentially I'm going to show you one of the ways that we decided to make a museum, and this one in particular. So, and I'll get right into it and talk about our first big challenge, that we faced at the museum is that the previous executive director of the entire historical society, Jenny Chin, who had overseen the renovation for almost a decade. That's about as long as it took total. It was 3 years that we were closed for the physical renovation, but was under works with planning well before that. But she died unexpectedly in April of 2022. So 4 months before we closed the museum. And understandably, her death left this huge gap in knowledge of the project. She had been doing all this work for a long time. She'd been working with staff at the Historical Society, but and she set a lot of things in motion. And that when I started in my role in late September of 2022, after we closed the museum to start the renovation, it was essentially trying to figure out what pieces have been set in place, and what work still needed to be done. But one of the biggest things that she set in motion was that she wanted to update the museum for a 21st century visitor. And she really had this goal of making it this wow experience for visitors, something really different. And she also wanted it to be structured thematically instead of chronologically. So you're going to see some pictures of the old gallery here in just a second. So it'll be a trip down memory lane for those of you who had visited, but and for those of you who haven't, to see what it used to look like. But that is the biggest difference. And so, as I mentioned, I started a few weeks after we had closed the museum. I had a steep learning curve, and I one of the biggest challenges that I faced was not just in addition to picking up kind of these pieces and what had been done, what still needed to be done, but to really finalize the details of what the thematic structure would be, which I'll get into later. And because it's something that when you think about how we tell history, it was hard for me to wrap my head around how, when you strip away the chronology, how do you tell it thematically? Because there's a lots of different ways that you could do that. My number one goal was not to confuse visitors with this process. So it's really hard to describe the sheer magnitude of a renovation of this size. And I certainly had no idea of all of the many details when I started in my role, but I will rattle off a whole laundry list of things here. So this is what the renovation entailed. It included, and you'll see pictures of some of these, artifact removal, demolition of the current build, walls and carpet and exhibits, new construction, updates to our life safety, because this building had been built in the 1980s, so a lot of code updates since then, over 40 years, brand new exhibit designs, writing and editing hundreds of exhibit labels, cleaning, exhibit fabrication, exhibit installation, and artifact installation. Thankfully, we have a really talented group of people at the Historical Society that were able to help figure out all those many different details. And we seem to have someone that always needed the skill we needed, that had the skill we needed to get the job done. And one of the things I'm most proud of as the leader of this project is the teamwork and congeniality that all of our staff continued to have throughout this project, even though it was such a massive undertaking. But I also want to highlight that we had help from a lot of individuals outside the agency as well. We really wanted to make sure that we are the State Historical Society. We're located in Topeka, but we represent the state of Kansas. And sometimes I think in the old museum and in our collections and just the artifacts that we have, we can lean a little too heavily on the northeast part of the state, Topeka and Lawrence, actually where I live, and this region. And so we really wanted to make sure that when people walked into the museum, that they felt like this was the Kansas that they know. They reflected them and their stories and their families. And so we have assets and images from historical societies across the state, and from libraries and other institutions who took the time to digitize and send us their photos. I had an outstanding group of exhibit script reviewers who gave me thoughtful feedback and ensured every label was accurate, peer-reviewed. And this is probably the most fun for me, is that we got to work with some of our most esteemed Kansans. This includes National Geographic photographer Jim Richardson, Academy Award-winning filmmaker Kevin Wilmot, artist Stan Hurd, and award-winning Grammy-nominated country music artist Martina McBride. That was a childhood dream come true, gotta be honest. So before her death, Jenny had contracted with Dimensional Innovations. They are known as DI. So you'll hear me say DI a lot tonight, and I'm referring to this company. So they are based out of Kansas City, and they were tasked with the big job of designing, fabricating, and installing all of the exhibits at the museum. And so well before we had closed the museum, our nonprofit fundraising arm, the foundation, privately fundraised $6 million to pay for the new exhibits. So, and then the state provided almost $1 million in infrastructure costs, construction, life safety updates, and so forth. But DI was selected by Jenny very intentionally because they have this really creative out of the box kind of thinking that she wanted. And she thought they'd be the perfect pairing for this wow experience that she was hoping would be communicated to visitors. Um, so my one person I know they're in the audience who's been to the museum, hopefully could back me up on this. But if you haven't been yet, I think one of the things that we hear a lot from visitors is how colorful the space is now. It's very dynamic, it's very vibrant, and that is very much a credit to DI. They really thought about the space and they put a lot of attention into all of the little details. So you'll see some of the photos here, but let's actually start with, if I can get this to work, um, the old gallery. So this was the entrance to the old gallery when you walked in. And this was from almost right before we closed, I believe, because over on the left side of the screen is the artifact that was welcoming everyone to the women's suffrage exhibit, the last special exhibit in our special exhibit gallery that we had before we closed. So you could walk to the left, and that was where our special exhibit gallery was located. You could go to the right, and that's where the permanent gallery was located. And so I had mentioned this, museum was built in the 1980s, and it actually officially opened in 1984. And everything at that time was done in-house. Everything was crafted by carpenters and welders and exhibit fabricators. I mean, it was really remarkable, and it was a really well done and well-crafted museum. And just a real quick history about the Historical Society itself and where the museum fits in. We just celebrated 150 years last year in 2025. And our first home was in the state capitol before we moved downtown, within the downtown area to the Memorial Building, which is really close to the Capitol. And that was our home from 1914 until about the late 1970s, or that early 1980s, when the decision was made to move the museum where it is currently out in West Topeka. And then our the library and the archives, cultural resources, all of that they moved out in the 1990s. And so that is where we have been ever since. But this maybe again is jogging some memories. This was kind of the first thing you saw if you went towards the permanent exhibit gallery. So again, a chronological telling of Kansas history. It wound visitors through 13,000 years of Kansas up to the recent past, which was a display of artifacts from the 1940s to the 1980s. But along the way, visitors got to see this reproduction, Wichita Grass Lodge. It was not built to scale, but it was certainly a visitor favorite. It's no longer at the museum. We also had the wagon on display, also not an artifact, a reproduction. Anchored our section on trails. We still have the wagon, but we actually cut it in half, lengthwise. I'm trying with the right term. So we still have a trail section, but we fit it in behind our train, and we needed to cut it down in size. So both halves are displayed, just not together anymore. Bleeding Kansas, it still has a very large presence in our gallery, and we're able to display even more Civil War battle flags, which is one of our most significant elements of our artifact collection. And then this, after you kind of wound your way through, this is, I have actually really forgotten what the old gallery looks like. So when I see these pictures, I have to like remember, like, where was this? But the train is kind of like, if you're facing this, like the train would be behind you. And then, so this was the farming section. The tractor is still on display. The windmill is still on display, but we have reorganized it to kind of cluster it all together in a different way. And because we pulled in a grain truck, which you'll get to see in a little bit. But I'll stop here just for a little bit on this collage, which shows a smattering of some more photos of the gallery to answer the question, why renovate? It's something that I got asked quite a bit when we were first embarking on this more than 3 years ago. And, there are several reasons for doing so. I mentioned what Jenny's vision and goal was to update for the 21st century visitor, to make it a wow experience. But really, it's when you look at these exhibits and then that recent pass down there in the corner, time marches on, and we had done minor updates, but nothing full scale like what we embarked upon, this complete redesign and renovation. And while, of course, history doesn't change, exhibit trends do become dated, and the exhibits were starting to show their age. And they were both in terms of the technology and interactives, but also the artifacts. And the example I like to use is that in the recent past case, we had a cassette tape deck, a TV, a tube TV, and a game control that were displayed to showcase modern technology. However, they predated many school group chaperones. So little in the students. So we felt that was why, and again, I say we like the royal we. I came in well after it had been underway, but that was really those were the big motivators. But again, I mentioned just technology changes too. So one of the things I find ironic working at a history museum, being a historian, is that in the 21st century, we all museum visitors live in the 21st century, and they have expectations that anywhere they go, there's going to be contemporary technology, even in a history museum, where you're talking about, however many years ago in the past. And so all of those reasons kind of collectively led to this decision. Now, thematic is, I think, a really interesting choice. And I mentioned at the beginning, it took me a while to wrap my head around how to do this, but I've really come around to why the benefits of doing a thematic structure rather than chronological. And it's really that you can more easily show change over time within certain topics, and it can really help history resonate to today. And it also allows us to make updates throughout the gallery instead of only adding on to the end, at the end of the chronology. And in fact, we intentionally built a dynamic gallery where we plan to rotate stories and artifacts through out numerous spaces not just in our special exhibit gallery where we rotate exhibits every 6 to 12 months. So those are some of the many benefits, and I will get into a little bit more detail of that when I get to the actual new gallery. But first, just because it's kind of fun to see, because again, if you've been to the museum, uh, this is just it's a perspective that I hope personally to never see again because it was so much work. But I want to just get into a little bit of what we went through with the artifact removal and demolition part because it was just so massive. It was such a massive undertaking. Um, so the step one in a renovation of this size is to remove all the artifacts that you can. We had approximately 2,000 or so artifacts in the gallery, and it took us 4 months to get all the artifacts out or protected. And you can see that this is just one example, and that it took 4 people, to get this huge painting out of one case. And so it took time, and we wanted to treat everything with a lot of care. Um, and, sometimes it was something like this really heavy Gatling gun that it took a lot of thought about how to get something out of a case. So some items were too large to move, or we had to move around, like the Gatling gun, I think just kind of got shuffled around in the gallery because it was so big and so heavy, but other items were too large to move out entirely. And this is one of them. And we try to cover and protect them the best that we could. This includes our 1860s log cabin, our 1880s train, which I know the primary focus of this photo here is the biplane, but if you look behind, you can see kind of through the plastic that T and S, that is the train, and it's still there. And our maintenance team literally built a wall, this plastic sheeting to try to protect it from all the demolition dust. It still got dirty, so we still had to clean it, but I did protect it from a majority of the dust. And so that alone was a feat because that's a very long train. But this is a good example of the other thing that we did and took advantage of. We had this biplane in the rafters of our museum since the 1980s. And so we carefully lowered it down. And so while it's on the ground and within reach, we decided to go ahead and clean it. And so this is our collections manager and her assistant carefully cleaning off 40 years of dust. And you can see this vacuum, they're wearing gloves. You can't tell from this angle, but her fingers, she's not letting the vacuum touch the fabric. She has her fingers in between so that the suction doesn't damage the fabric because this is very old, very, very fragile material. So they cleaned all this dust off. Turns out this plane is not white. It is brown when you actually take the time and clean it. And what they discovered was that they're on one of the wings. This is something we had never known before. On one of the wings, written in adhesive tape, was "Wind from South," which is it was a new revelation for this artifact we've had in our collection since the 1930s, actually. So amazing. And then, so this is an example, you remember on that collage photo, I showed you that our recent past image. So that's that same case. And so after all the artifacts are taken out and protected, then they started removing the casework. And so all of that, dismantling cases, tearing down walls, removing carpet, removing old track lighting, and more, it generated 35 loads of a 40-yard dumpster. And all of that work was done by our staff in-house, which was amazing. So here's a picture of it a little more clean. There's that train covered by the plastic wall. The plane is still up in the ceiling on this angle. You can see the cabin in the way back covered in plastic. The windmill is in there. But the exhibit gallery is 23,100 square feet. And I would ask people when I walked them in to this space after everything was out, I said, okay, do you think it feels bigger or smaller than before? And it was funny to hear the answers because I heard both. And so that was, in some days it felt way too big, and some days not big enough to do all the stories that we wanted to do. But let me get into the new museum and what you can expect. So I'm going to talk about, oh, and there's the biplane, by the way, hanging in its new spot, freshly cleaned and looking so great. And you can get such a close-up view to it now. Okay, so this is a gallery map. And I'm not going to expect you to memorize it. I just wanted to show you kind of from a bird's eye view as I walk it through each section, I'm gonna go through each of these galleries, and I'm just gonna give you an overview, some of the themes, some of the key artifacts and stories that we are sharing here. But I mentioned before, the biggest challenge was for me personally was how to define this thematically. I didn't want to confuse visitors, and it was just something I was really worried about. And so one day I remember, this is when I first started the job. Did a lot of listening to the staff that were there, talked to people, scholars and historians of Kansas history, read a lot of books, and just was like thinking, thinking, thinking. And you should know a little bit about me is that I was not born in Kansas. And in fact, when I moved to Kansas for graduate school, I went to KU 15, 16 years ago. I really thought, oh, Kansas. I won't be here long. This is not the state for me. It is flat. There's just tornadoes and you know what? There's nothing going on in Kansas. And I my what I say is, well, one of those perceptions was immediately dismantled when I started walking up the hills of KU's campus. I was like, okay, not flat. Um, anyway, and obviously here I am. The big irony of my life is that I am directing the State History Museum, and I am one of the biggest champions for Kansas. But I say that is because I studied the history of Kansas, particularly its women, women's suffrage, and the work that they did that made me really fall in love with this place. So just to set that up for, as I was sitting there thinking about Kansas, and I just something popped in my head. I was like, what is Kansas? It's all of these things that I said. It's filled with sunflowers and tornadoes. It's scarred by the Dust Bowl. It's still defined by the events of Bleeding Kansas, but it's also so much more. It's the stories of everyday people who did extraordinary things. And keeping in mind that, I was thinking about my women's suffrage that I researched for my project. So that foundation really led me to think about kind of the next big question. So why Kansas? And perhaps driven by my own experiences, I considered why people chose to come here, but more importantly, why they chose to stay. And so the rest of the galleries answer those questions, where they share stories of Kansans who fought for their beliefs, who made their homes here, who developed industries, and who pushed for a society they wish to see. And you can see that from this big picture: bleeding Kansas, changing Kansas, making Kansas, connecting Kansas. Those are our four main galleries that really anchor all of those main themes. And so I'll be weaving in some renovation highlights as I go. And this is the first one I'll share because it's in our introductory gallery. What is Kansas? And, Kansas has an abundance of different symbols, and one of the most iconic are the bison. So we have two bison now on display. The one that is on the right, the smaller one, is one that we had in our collection and on display before. But bison are herd animals, and we really felt like he needed a friend. And so we actually got the bigger one donated from the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation because they have a buffalo land management program. And so we got him taxidermied and put on display, and you can see a little bit of the behind the scenes of how we went about doing that. Um, but the flowers and grasses that they're set within are reminiscent of the Kansas prairie. The rock formation they're on, it nods to the Niobrara chalk formations of the Little Jerusalem Badlands. So it's a very dynamic display. And what you're going to see is the finished product here in just a second. But one of the things I'll share on this slide, because I don't just usually take pictures of kids, but this is my son Felix. And I like to include this photo because I told you I'm going to weave some of my personal story within this. Well, there's a reason that I started my job in late September and not earlier. I was hired in June, but I was 8 months pregnant at the time. And so everyone agreed the best thing to do would be to, have my child in July, stay home with him, and then start after that. And so I started this job, a huge job, with a 3-month-old. And I'll just say it was very hard. I think probably some of the hardest months of my entire life that fall, but I persevered, and thanks to a lot of great people who helped me through. But it's just so fun to see him experiencing mommy's museum, as he calls it. And so you can see this bison display set within these huge banners where these symbols, and that one happens to be the bison, there's changing projections of symbols of Kansas. And it's just this is a nod to what I said earlier, this dynamic, vibrant space. It is just so colorful, and it really, really reinforces what is Kansas, kind of some of the many different answers and perceptions that we have. And some of them sometimes will surprise you, and sometimes they'll confirm what you think. But let's get into Bleeding Kansas, the first of the four galleries that I'll cover today. So it's the only one that is mostly chronological. It's hard to tell that story any other way. It is such it's a story that is really dependent on the cause and effect of the time period and all the violent and political events that occurred in such rapid succession during the 7-year period. But we start off with the people of territorial Kansas, and look at it from the perspective of the people who were here, who decided to come here, whether they were the indigenous peoples already here, the free state settlers, the pro-slavery advocates, the abolitionists, or the enslaved and free African Americans. And kind of having you primed with this question of what is the free state? And what does it mean to you? And what does it mean to these different people? And from there, we walk you through the slavery's role at the heart of Bleeding Kansas, but more impactfully, some of the stories that we do have about the Underground Railroad that was occurring in Kansas at this time. We actually hire some voice actors to read some of the stories that we have from those who both were seeking freedom and helping. And it's just a really powerful section where you get to kind of just sit and ponder. We then get into a really comprehensive timeline that walks through the events of Bleeding Kansas from 1854 to 1861. John Brown, which you see there on the second picture, we did a reproduction of the Curry mural at the state capitol. You can get a lot closer to it. It's not at full scale, but it's close. But John Brown makes an appearance again before we continue on with the story of the Civil War and the Plains Wars. And then it comes back to this final big picture question of the legacy of Bleeding Kansas. And again, really just this question of the Free State. I mentioned before the Civil War battle flags. So I don't have you can see on the first picture, actually, good. I was just like, do I have a picture? So the one on the left, I should say, you can, up above that first kind of exhibit, you see 4 flags up on the wall. So our walls are 30 feet tall. And we thought we really wanted to try to do a better job of using our vertical space. And so we have 9 Civil War battle flags on that wall. And the ones on the left are 6 foot by 6 foot flags. And it is so striking to see them all there. But what I say when I give tours is one of the things that I love about getting them up there like that, which by the way was a scary day. I did not have to figure it out, thankfully. Someone else did. But I said you can read the words on those flags so clearly, even from the ground so far below. And it really reinforces what those flags were initially used for as signals of communication. So it's just like it's another wow impact that not from technology, but from the artifacts themselves. But we also have a chair that John Brown supposedly slept in, and a shackle worn by an enslaved person in Missouri, actually, but somehow made its way over to Kansas. Here's a closer look at that mural. So that's a different angle. That's one of the things that you are greeted with in the Bleeding Kansas section. And you can see our photographer at work, and our exhibit director and a designer who figured out how many photos they had to take in order to reproduce it at the scale they wanted. And it was quite a feat. And I'm really glad they got it to work because it is really striking there on that wall. Okay. So many of the stereotypes and perceptions of Kansas have to do with its land. So Making Kansas deals with those themes and stories. You think about labels like the wheat state, the breadbasket of the world, the tornadoes and the Dust Bowl, and a lot of those, again, those stereotypes and those ideas of who we are as Kansas are rooted in those themes. So here we have farming in front of you. And that is one of the biggest anchor exhibits of this section. We also talk about ranching and cowboys, resources from the earth that are including coal and oil and minerals and rocks and brick and pottery, but also the impact of extreme weather too. And so I mentioned, when I was showing you the old gallery, the windmill is back. You can see the cabin over there in the distance, but we brought in this grain truck. And so I'm not a farmer, and I usually tell people it's probably pretty obvious. I didn't, my grandpa has a farm in Indiana. He rented out the farmland, but he did have a grain truck. He had a truck like this he drove around. And so that's my one best connection to this farming story. But when we were talking about as a staff farming and some of the ideas and themes that kept coming up, it was particularly around the idea of harvest time and the community elements that people felt really strongly associated with that. And one of the visuals that people mentioned that they love to see with the line of grain trucks on the roads every year, and that it's like one of those signs of harvest time. And so we had this grain truck in our collection since I think about like early 2000s. It has not been on display permanently before. And so we decided, even though it's really big, the emotional connection that so many people have with this truck from the 1950s that was used in Allen County, Kansas, that we decided to go ahead and bring it in. And what I say is, so when you have a train in your gallery, everything is smaller. This was big. It was a big deal, but it's just funny because you can see the train there right next to it. That, it's only a train can make a grain truck seem small. But it's been really fun because we've had it's exactly what we anticipated. A lot of people share stories. Some people saying, wait a second, that's not history. I'm still driving a truck just like that. But or sharing what they remember riding in a truck with their grandfather or driving the truck themselves, whatever the case. So that's our biggest artifacts. But the other one, which you can kind of peep over the cabin, which is another of our highlighted artifacts from this section. It's the 1860s Humbarger log cabin from Saline. I just had someone correct me how to say that. I hopefully I said that right. If not, I'm so sorry. Saline County. And it was on display before. People were able to see the first floor of that cabin for 40 years, but we wanted to get them up to the second floor. And so we built this ramp, which you'll see here in a couple slides. We put the biplane at the very top, which it gives you one of the best views of that plane that you've been able to see in many years. But something else we did is we brought in a box car. So again, grain truck is big, box car is even bigger. That was a very exciting day. That again, I'm really glad I didn't have to be the one to figure it out, but you can see it being delivered there in the bottom right and bringing it into the museum. So we have this wall in our side of the museum that is removable. And it allowed us to get the clearance we needed, but the box car came in with inches to spare. And we have an amazing facilities manager that helped us figure out how to place it and get it around to its location. But the boxcar is part of one of our most exciting new features of the gallery. It's a ramp that we constructed. And I'm really glad we have it now for people to see because when I was talking about this before it was built, people would look at me kind of funny, like, what do you mean you built a ramp? I said, well, it's not just a ramp. It's like an overlook. It's a really long ramp, but you can see the entrance there that winds people up past a dugout that is not the same sod house from the old gallery. This is a new exhibit we put in. It tells the story of Nicodemus with artifacts related to this is the only remaining all black settlement west of the Mississippi River. And so you look into the dugout on the way, you get to walk into that box car, and half of it is staged as it would have looked when they were used as temporary living quarters primarily by Mexican American families when they immigrated here in the early 1900s to work on the railroads and the agricultural industry. And I'm just having this realization that I'm pretty sure one of the images that we have is from Newton, actually. I'm pretty sure that is on one of our panels. We talk about the community there. But the other half has oral histories of Mexican American individuals who either lived in boxcars or had family members who did. And then also along the ramp, you can see a nice shot of it here, but I'll give you a close-up look here, is a beautiful mural. So that's Stan Hurd. You may know his name, and you may actually know him because of his crop art that he's become really world famous for doing in the last 20, 30 years. But he also is a painter. And Stan actually painted the mural that is located behind the train back in the late 1980s. And so when we were building this ramp, and it's like it's big ramp needs a big wall, and a big wall needs a nice mural. And so we asked Stan if he'd come back and paint a second mural for us, and he agreed. And the first, which you can kind of see there on the right, the first vignette that he paints and tells a story of is the 1966 Topeka tornado. And you got that little grain truck there. It's an inspiration for everyone. But then the rest of his mural highlights 1960s and 1970s Kansas. And there is just packed full of so many different little stories and people and symbols. And he's actually still working on it, finishing up some of the details, but it's been so much fun to watch him watch it take shape. Okay, the train still there. It is the anchor to our gallery connecting Kansas. So it really focuses on the transportation more broadly, forged within and outside Kansas, but of course the railroads were such an important part of the Kansas story. It was a catalyst for so much change within the state. It allowed employment, it provided an avenue for employment, immigration, political influence. I mean, it was I think I saw somewhere that the Kansas was like had at one point the second most railroads of any state. I mean, one of our big themes we talk about in perceptions of Kansas, it's the crossroads. It's in the center. And what does that mean? That sometimes people dismiss us as flyover country, but no, we're embracing that, everything feeds through Kansas. We're at the heart of it all. We're the heartland. And the railroad is a big part of that story. And so we have some displays on the other side of the train. And I will note that I mentioned our budget with DI, the $6 million. Well, that budget had been set back in 2018. And I'm like, well, a few things changed, a few things happened between 2018 and 2022. Kind of raising prices, and that budget didn't stretch quite as far as what they thought it would in 2018. So our staff, our exhibit team of 2 full-time and 1 part-time person took on the exhibit work behind the train. And so I'm really proud of them. It was a huge effort. It's a huge space, but they've done a great job of building new cases and getting some displays that really match and melt with what DI did. All right, I'm getting close to the end. And then I'd love to hear your questions. But I have one last gallery to cover. And it's Changing Kansas. So there's this great William Allen White quote where he says, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's something about if it's going to happen first in the nation, it's going to happen in Kansas. And it's really amazing to me. And going back to when I started to really study and understand the history of Kansas, and I looked at the women's suffrage movement in particular for my dissertation, I was amazed at how many firsts Kansas had during particularly the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it was in such a variety of topics, from prohibition to women's suffrage to populism and more, and public health, of course, here with Dr. Crumbine. And so Changing Kansas looks at a lot of those different stories of social reform movements, and also acknowledges the fact that Kansans may have not always agreed on what it constitutes an ideal society or progress or success. It has sometimes led to conflict of beliefs and ideas, but it really also just like looks at how Kansas has often been at the heart of these social issues and reforms that have national implications and why that is. I think it is something I love sharing with people. Did you know this about Kansas? And so that's essentially, this gallery does a lot of that. So I mentioned a few of them, but populism, women's rights, public health, education, Brown v. Board, of course, another big one. And then at the anchor of it is the press and how newspapers has had such a historically significant role in Kansas as history. And for this, the Historical Society ourselves, our own history. But it's one of our other really cool displays. And I tell you, a picture does not capture how great this is. So hopefully I'm convincing you to come visit and see it for yourself. But the bottom in that back corner, that big black machine that I'll tell you, a lot of people walked by in the old gallery and had no idea what it was. Well, that is a really significant artifact because it's William Allen White's printing press that he used at the Emporia Gazette. It's actually what he used to print his 1896 piece, What's the Matter with Kansas? But of course, that technology has changed quite a bit. And so one of the things when we were talking with DI, we're like, we really want people to understand the importance and history of the newspapers. And so they built this display that's 15 foot tall, and it's a projection of different newspapers from throughout time, throughout history, that really cover and show the importance of Kansas and its relationship to the press. But right across the way, another really significant artifact is those doors. Those are the doors from the Capitol from the 1893 Legislative War, when both the populace and the Republicans believed they claimed true ownership, were the rightfully elected majority of the House. And the populace locked themselves into the chamber. The Republicans beat down the doors. Those are the doors. It's one of those, to me, really impactful artifacts that had been kind of tucked away for a long time, that now you get to see so much more clearly. We have some additional sub-galleries in this space, and one of them is pictured here. It's Kansans Go to War. So we cover the Civil War and Bleeding Kansas, but every other war from the Spanish-American War through recent conflicts is covered here. And one of the things I like to point out about this case is that we really wanted to identify a personal belonging of soldiers from every war that we could display and have that symmetry. And so you'll notice that jackets are represented throughout, but also boots. That was one of the items that we have in our collection, boots from a soldier from every war represented. And I think that's just really fitting, very much of walking in their shoes. But we talk about both the abroad stories and the home front stories within these displays. And you can, on the panels below, share some timeline throughout too. And then the other gallery, sub-gallery, is Celebrating Kansas, and that's where Martina McBride, who I mentioned at the beginning, narrated a video for us that is, what does it mean to be a Kansan? And the very last thing, and then it's my questions slide, is I just wanted to show that one last thing that we did. We still have our special exhibit gallery. We're changing out exhibits. It's on the other side of the room now. And a benefit is that it's up against this roll-up door, which is an entry into storage, our collection storage. So we built a window. So people can now see a portion of our collection storage through the window, which is what you're seeing people see. And so you get a glimpse of some of the 122,000 artifacts that we keep back there. And it's a great way for us to get to show off more of our artifacts because we can only display about 1,000 in the exhibit gallery. But we can also bring in some really big items that maybe we can't fit out in the gallery. So if you've got some keen eyes, you might say, you know, that looks like a helicopter back there. And you'd be right. It is a helicopter. And it is one of those things that we probably won't ever be able to fit in the gallery, but it's a great spot right there in that window. So that is what I have for you all. So I would love to hear questions that you have.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yes, bravo.
Oh, thank you.
Let me see. I did think there was one question. Is the dock of Siddon in Wichita included?
It is. Yes, great question. Not only is it included, we have three you can listen to three of the individuals who participated in the sit-in. You pick up an audio puck and you can hear their story to actually talk about it. So it's a great interactive, and it's part of our civil rights display. And so it's kind of smack there in the middle. So yes, it is represented.
Cool. Any questions here in the room? Yes. And feel free to type in the chat, everybody watching as well, if you've got more questions. I guess, let me see. People raising hands. Let me see. If you want to if you want me to, I can click allow to talk. If you want to be, those of you on Zoom, if you want to ask a question verbally, maybe just say so in the chat and I will click allow to talk on your thing. Oh, Tennessee Town and Quindaro, or Quindaro? I'm not sure how that's
Yeah,
spelled.
Quindaro. Quindaro. Yes, yes, Quindaro has multiple mentions, particularly in our Bleeding Kansas section. We talk about its founding. It was actually named for a woman who was Wyandotte, Nancy Quindaro Brown. She and her husband, they were abolitionists, helped found the town. And then we revisit it in the enslaved and free African American section because we have some artifacts related to that town. And then we mention it again because Clarina Nichols, who was an abolitionist, and she has one of her stories is about assisting someone on the Underground Railroad when she lived in Quindaro. So it has a lot of mention. Tennessee Town. Oh, I love these are great questions. Tennessee Town gets a small mention when we talk about Charles Sheldon in our education section and the kindergarten that he helped to start. And yes, Susanna Salter, the first woman elected mayor of a town in the US, it definitely gets a mention. So I don't have a picture of it, but there is a huge section in the Changing Kansas section called Women's Rights. And I joke, it's my dissertation in exhibit form. It isn't, don't be scared away. It's not that wordy, but it is so wonderful for me to get to highlight these women who I got to study 15 years ago. Because they have such important stories. So yes, great questions.
Great. Oh, and those of you that raised your hand, I did enable your mic, so you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. But I have one that kind of going on this. What was the public engagement process like as the word got out about these renovations? I mean, there must have been so many people saying like, "Oh, you have to have this in there. You have to show this and that." And how do you balance all that and still do the themes that you're talking about and make something coherent?
Yes. Okay. So remember, I said keep in mind, how do you make a museum? Have that question in because I think that we would all have a slightly different answer. And at some point you just have to you just have to you choose your path. So before I started, there were a couple of ways that they gathered the visitor feedback and community engagement. They had focus groups that they did with individuals across the state, particularly for different groups. I think it was Mexican American community, African American community, Indigenous community, but there were also visitor observation studies and surveys before we closed the museum to kind of get a sense, I think particularly like what are people's favorites, artifacts, stories. But here's what I'll say is there'll be something, there's, and we've had this from people. It's like, what about this story? What about this? I would love to hear this. I want to know what you want to see because we have a lot of opportunities to make updates in a lot of different ways. So if there's something that you feel really passionate about, like this needs to be in a museum, and your museum, and here's why. I'd love to hear this because I love to hear your passion about what is it that makes you think of what is Kansas, and why. And that there's a good chance that we can display it at some point because of this thematic structure. We can make those updates, and we will be making those updates regularly. Yes, I love Gretchen is killing with all these questions. I will, um, I know I want to hear from Brennan and Donna too, but on the chat, are you displaying the fantastic map of Kansas with all the indigenous groups territory? Yes, if it's the one I'm thinking of, which it is a fantastic map. We do have that in our Bleeding Kansas section. It actually begins the timeline, but we have it in a couple of different spots where we reference it. But one of the things I didn't mention in our What is Kansas intro gallery is that we actually start off with talking about the different indigenous peoples who have called Kansas home. And this is both those who were here before it was before the Indian Removal Act in 1830 who were called Kansas home, those who were removed here, and those who are still here. And so we cover that in that first section. And then we actually have interviewed 8 different tribal members and are hoping to do more to get for them to share in their own words of what Kansas means to them and a little more about their history. It's a great display. Right. Other questions?
Oh, I sort of random question. The exhibits in the basement of the Capitol building, are those under the
Mhm.
umbrella of
They
your
are.
museum?
Yes. The Capitol Visitor Center is actually under my division. I oversee, I introduce myself as the director of the Kansas Museum of History, but my official title is Division Director, Museum and Education. Um, which no one really knows what that means. However, what it does mean is that I oversee our museum staff and our education staff. That includes the tour guides at the state capitol. We oversee the exhibits that are on display there too.
I'm curious if you can help us know what special exhibits might be coming up.
Yes.
The Kansas Magazine celebration, if that's still up right now, but what do you have slated
Mhm.
soon?
Great question. We were just talking about what our schedule was, so I feel like I planted your question. Um, so yes, right now our special exhibit is a collaboration with the Kansas Magazine. It was their 80th anniversary last year, and it is such a it was such a perfect exhibit to start off with this renovation because it's such a celebratory look at Kansas, and it really highlights the different stories and regions and diversity and the geography and just all so many things. So that's currently up and will be up through May 31st. So if you're interested, and if you want to be inspired to go out and explore the state, come see that exhibit. The next exhibit, which will be opening in early July of 2026. Wow, that's so many months. That's so close. Is Kansas 1776. So this year is the 250th of the United States. So this is our exhibit to recognize that. Um, of course, Kansas was not a state in 1776. And so we are doing something a little bit different for us. It's actually an environmental history focus. So really trying to simulate, how different Kansas looked at that time, the people who were here. So highlighting some of those indigenous peoples, Kaw Nation, Wichita, Pawnee, and Osage in particular. But then we'll take you up to today and show how we have changed since 1776 as well. So that'll be opening in July. And then it's not officially official yet, but I feel pretty confident to say that in 2027, wow, that feels weird to say, we're going to be doing a special exhibit on music history and music in Kansas, which I think is going to rock. So all the puns intended.
That's so cool. The music history is big. I've done some writing, local history writing, and it's like it's so. I did it when I did a story about like music history in Wichita and stuff. It is so fascinating when you get back to a century ago and more and what they were
Yep.
doing.
Oh, it's gonna be so big. I'm excited to, we'll be working with my colleague in archives because he's been doing a lot of collecting with music, particularly from the 1960s. All these bands like the Fabulous Flippers and um, that's the only one I can remember because I love that name so much. All these others that I'm sure he would, if he's watching me right now, I'd be like, "What are you doing?" I talk about this every week, but I'm excited to get him to help me with this and to think about how to structure this exhibit. So that's to come.
Oh, and the beat. Oh, the beat. Gretchen said the beat poets. Wichita was a beat
Yes.
hotspot. The
Mhm.
Wichita Vortex, as they call it, right? So anyway,
Yes.
there's
Oh, and I will say, Gretchen, yes, Girard, Kansas, The Appeal to Reason, and the Little Blue Books all have a presence in the Power of the Press section. Um, it's such a fascinating story. We have a lot of the Little Blue Books on display. And it's great. And so beginning to highlight also just like this really unique part of Kansas history down in Southeast Kansas with the Appeal to Reason in particular. And then, yes, we still have a museum store and we sell lots of books there, but lots of other great things too.
awesome. Well, this has definitely inspired me to definitely visit the museum on my next trip to Topeka, and maybe I need to take a
Great,
special to see this because it sounds so cool.
good.
And yeah, Pradeep says thank you for doing this, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. So yes, I
You're very
definitely.
welcome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes.
You're welcome. And yes, okay, there's Brennan and there's Donna. Okay, because I wondered. So Brennan, sorry, before we go, Western Kansas is represented in many different ways. We do have a lot of things on the Cowboys, and we talk about Bill, like Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill. We talk about Custer, Kansas, ground zero for the Plains Indian Wars. Yes, we have a whole case devoted to the Plains Wars. It actually is at the end of Bleeding Kansas because Bleeding Kansas can be such an eastern side of the state story that we wanted to make sure we were covering Western Kansas too. So they have a presence there. A lot of the forts come in that way. And so yes, and there's many other things. Like we talk about some of the oil that is out in western northwest Kansas. Nicodemus is a great Western Kansas story. And there's more that I'm forgetting, but that's a smattering.
Cool. Well, it seems like you got the coolest job. I mean,
I agree. It's a dream job. It's amazing. Yes.
I'm sure you have days like anybody else, but bravo, it's so cool what you guys have done. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks so much for having me. And I will tell you, please let me know if you make it up here. I love to meet people in person. And so if you make it up, just send me a note or let me know, like let whoever's at the front desk that you're there. If I'm able to, I'll come say hi and meet you in person. It's been so great getting to talk with people and to get their feedback. And yeah, it's that now is one of the most fun parts of my job. Now that I got through the super fun part of thinking about this renovation and getting that done.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'll definitely do that. And okay, I guess I'll sign us off now. Thanks again.
Great.
And yeah, we'd love to have you back anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.